I'm only going to spend a few moments. First, welcome. My name is Steve Waldman. I want to thank you all for being here tonight and tomorrow, more importantly. And I need to actually apologize in advance. I'm actually feeling very under the weather, so I'm going to leave right after this. I don't mean to have no aspersions on anybody. But I was going to make a bad joke about, is there a doctor in the house? But that seems sort of silly in this case. But I'll spend a few minutes tomorrow on what prompted this gathering. But tonight I only want a few moments to say how grateful I am that you're really all here. We have very important work to do. There are rare diseases, including appendiceal cancer, that are simply devastating to people. They ruin families, they upend lives, they end lives. Our job starting tomorrow, starting tonight and through tomorrow, will be to get together, try to think about how to accelerate research and development, hopefully therapies and cures, how to construct tools for collaboration, how to align incentives, which otherwise seem to get in the way of a lot of things, how to implement regulatory and institutional policy changes, how to structure and finance it all to end these diseases. I know there are many opportunities and there are many obstacles in the science and the legal and the institutional and the regulatory arenas in the funding for all this. We're here to determine how best to overcome those obstacles and then hopefully to pursue the opportunities. The job of the panelists in each session will be to attempt to provide, I would put it, an epiphany. Some piece of information, some data point, some theory, some argumentation, some construct that allows each of the people in this room to walk away saying, I didn't know that before, I know it now. That knowledge will actually influence some of my research. That knowledge will actually make a difference in my conclusions. That knowledge will actually allow me to think through new approaches. Hopefully that will accelerate innovations and new ideas in the science, in the policy, in the institutional regulatory thinking, and the means to fund it all, ultimately resulting in, we hope, real benefits for patients. And for all the rest of the folks here who are not on a specific panel, and I wish we didn't have to do that. I wish we could have put everybody on panels, but then this would not be a one-day workshop. It would be a one-week workshop, and we thought that might be a little bit grand. It's to do the same with your comments, with your questions during the time reserved for each of these sessions, where there will be opportunity for all that, and during the breaks in between, where I know people will certainly get together and talk. Finally, our job afterwards will determine how, after the workshop ends, we can best keep all this going forward. Some folks have told me that this is the first time there's been an actual real scientific conference on appendiceal cancer. I hope that we can continue with these efforts and to extend out way beyond appendiceal cancer to other rare cancers and to other rare diseases and try to make a real difference. Please keep all that in mind as you go through tonight and tomorrow. Lives literally depend on it all. Thank you again for your willingness to be part of this. I look forward to working with you all. And that's really all I think I can do before I have to go back to the bathroom. And now for the fireside chat, Greg, it's all up to you. Thank you. Thank you all. And I wish I could stay, but I think I should get to bed. So
I'll call you later and tell you everything that happened.
Take care. Thank you.
I've known Steve and his wife Kathy for over 30 years, and I'm delighted to be here. I'm Greg Simon. I'm doing what any one of you could do, which is to ask a really smart person questions to which I don't know the answer. I've done a few things. I ran the Cancer Moonshot for Vice President Biden and the Biden Cancer Initiative after that. Prior to that, I started Faster Cures 20 years ago. Mike Milken has a book coming out today about the history of faster cures, and also started the Melanoma Research Alliance. When I started the Melanoma Research Alliance, I did a lot of reading to the point where I had med school hypochondria and could barely shave. And I called a friend of mine who was involved in a lot of melanoma, and I said, you know, this was in 2007. I said, it doesn't seem like anything is working. And he said, that's because it's not. So I said, I'm going to have Steven Rosenberg, Don Morton, Levi Garraway, Jed Wolchik. I can't tell them nothing's working. He said, yeah, you can. They know it. So we put a bunch of people in a room like just this size and didn't let anybody give any presentations. And we changed the way they did funding in melanoma so that a third of the money would go only to new researchers, third of the money only to inter-institutional collaborations, third of the money to the old guard. Within a few years, they had funded Jim Allison's work, and you know what happened after that. And today, I meet so many melanoma survivors that I would never have met in 2007. So change is possible, even when you start with the premise that nothing works. I'm delighted tonight to talk with Chris Austin. Now, I asked Chris to send me his CV, and he had the gall to do it. And I told him it's still printing at my house. So I have a shorter version. But in the kitchen of biomedical research, Chris puts the rat in ratatouille because he knows how to do all of the cooking. He was in the bowels of the Human Genome Project, if I can use that metaphor. And he had the good sense to hire my son as an intern when my son was just starting college. My son was in charge of getting unemployed automotive robots to talk to each other because they all had different languages. And he put that together, and he put a quality assurance program together. 10 years later, he goes to visit Chris, and he comes home and says, "Dad, I'm worried to death." I said, "What's the matter?" He said, "They're still using my QA program." But Chris has been involved not just in the Human Genome Project, but in changing the way we do IRBs, in changing the way we do clinical trials, in changing the way we engage patients in rare disease research. And he's done all that despite the burden of education at Harvard, Mass General, and Harvard Medical School. I had the benefit of a public school education, which is why when I was diagnosed with leukemia, I happened to call my doctor 4 days after a physical. I landed in San Francisco, and it was almost closing time in Washington. And of course, he's a doctor, doesn't work Fridays. And I said, "How am I doing?" Because I'd had a couple of prostate biopsies. And he said, "Oh, your PSA is fine. But by the way, you have leukemia." And I thought to myself, I went to public school, but I don't think that's how you use "by the way." I think you use "by the way" like there's a piece of tissue paper on your shoe. Not you have 180,000 white cells. So that was fun. Anyway, the wonderful thing about Chris is he has been doing this for decades, ran NCATS, the National Center for Accelerating Translational Science. I had worked on a paper with David Baltimore, Ed Benz, Gail Cassell, Merle Weinberg, urging the NIH to change the intramural program to be more translational. NCATS was the result of that after the beginning of the Obama administration. NCATS had a lot of problems, mainly Congress, not science, but mainly Congress. We won't get into that tonight so much. But the thing about Chris is he has seen it from a holistic perspective. He has been involved in changing the guts of medical research, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So just to get this out of the way, of course, everything we're doing can be replicated by AI, right? So I asked Bard, not my friend Bard, who died of multiple myeloma several years ago, a year before they figured out CAR T therapy for multiple myeloma, which is always the problem. But Google's Bard, which is their version of ChatGPT. So I asked Bard, what is the most cited paper in appendiceal cancer? And I bet none of you have the same answer. You ready? Paul Gunn, 1977. It's been cited 1,000 times. Do I believe that? I'm not sure, but if that's true, that's really sad, right? 1977? Some of you weren't even here in 1977, and some of us weren't doing this in 1977. I had just left my rock band, but that's another story. So that's where AI will help us, is letting us know that no one's reading these papers. So Chris, let me start with a couple of very quick questions, and then I want to get it deeper into this meat of it all. Yeah. Why do people get involved in rare disease research when there's so many other things they can do?
Because they matter so much to the patients that have them. That's really what I found most infectious, frankly, about rare disease research. It's very personal. and there are stories that are very compelling. They're not stories that have to do with statistics or healthcare costs, although those too. It's about particular people with particular families and particular stories, and something happens to them and their life gets turned upside down. And I found that very compelling. I also found the community of people, and there are several of them here in this room, the community of rare disease researchers and patients and scientists, doctors, et cetera, are a real special breed because they're attracted to the very human side of medical research, which sometimes people lose track of. You know, it's very easy to turn yourself into an empire builder and lose track of why you got into this in the first place.
Yeah.
Very hard to do that if you work on rare diseases.
Right. I get that. Well, let's talk about the pace of play. You know, they just did the Masters golf tournament. For your average golf course, the pace of play is 4 hours. Mm-hmm. If you take longer than that, people yell at you. Yeah. If you take shorter than that, nobody yells at you, but you don't have much fun. Yeah. So why is our pace of play in rare disease research so slow? I'm asking it at a very high level. We'll get into the details later. Yeah. But is it the people? Is it the money? Is it the institutional biases? Is it the funding of other things that we think are rare diseases but aren't really?
Right. Yeah. Well, I'll answer the question, but I think it is important for us to realize that it is a world that's quite different than it was when I started in rare disease research right on the heels of the Human Genome Project. If we think about back in the late 90s, early 2000s, very few people and very few companies worked on rare diseases. Almost everyone worked on common diseases. And over the last 20 years, that's changed dramatically, such that for the last 5 years or more, the majority of new FDA approvals are for rare diseases or orphan drugs, as they call there. So there has been a lot of headway, and we could talk about why that is. The problem for rare diseases is a numbers problem. So believe it or not, I spent a lot of my career asking crazy questions like this, like how many rare diseases are there? And this one over here will remember that we've been asking ourselves that question for a very long time, and it's the conventional number is about 7,000, maybe closer to 10,000 to 13,000. It sort of depends on how you define the word disease. But in any case, whenever you have 10,000 of anything, and you're picking them off one at a time, your progress is going to be slow. And so I did a calculation. I've told you this. I did a calculation a few years ago about at the current rate of progress, where there's about 2 diseases which go from the untreatable to the treatable category every year. And by treatable, I mean FDA approval. It will be conservatively 2,000 years before there is a treatment for every rare disease.
Right. So
and it's one of the characteristics. One of the things that I tell people is, so if there's any statistic that tells you we cannot continue doing what we're doing, that should be it.
That should be it. Yeah. Are we talking to the wrong audience? We always want to yell at the government, do this better, give us more money, do this faster.
Yeah.
And then there's the venture world and the investment world.
Yep.
And then there are the medical institutions, which are surrounded by here.
Yep.
And then there are the patient groups.
Yep.
Are we talking to the wrong audience when we're talking to the investors and the government? And we should be talking more to the patient community and having them organize research?
Yeah. Well, I think this is something, and we can see it in the rare cancer community, but we see it in the rare disease community and non-cancer as well. If we look at the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation, or the Melanoma Research Foundation, or the Adenoid Cystic Carcinoma Foundation, or on and on and on, there are great examples of leaders that catalyze a change in a very, very effective way. And you told the story about the MRA, which is was a perfect example of that. And so I have taken the position, and I did when I ran NCATS, that we should have patients on every research team. Every project that NCATS did had to have patients on the research team from the very beginning. I'm not talking about when we need them for clinical trials and we say, oh yeah, you're really important to us, but we're only going to go after you when we need you to get our recruitment goals. You know, people see through that very quickly.
Yeah.
And it also it prevents us from having access to what patients bring, which is deep, deep knowledge of their disease. I mean, people underestimate, you know, how many people have I met who were English majors in college and didn't take a single science course? If they have a diagnosis in their family, within 2 weeks, they know more about the disease than most professors. They also bring urgency and focus. You know, scientists I love scientists, I am one myself, but scientists are like golden retrievers going on a walk. They're interested in everything. You know, they go, oh, there's a squirrel. Oh, we'll go over here. And that's great for fundamental research, but it doesn't get you a drug. And patients really keep you focused. The other thing patients do is they bring funding when it's necessary, directly and indirectly. The other thing they do is they tell us what parts of the disease are most relevant to them. Right?
Right.
And so when we come out with a drug, it actually does something that matters to people. And that's important for FDA, it's important for payers, it's important for patients, all that stuff, and we don't do it. So yeah, I think, I've said this many times, that I think patient involvement of the research team is one of the major disruptive technologies in rare disease research. And we ought to approach it that way. The problem when you do that is, as the old adage says, everybody loves disruptive innovation until they get disrupted.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, you know, you're the enemy and you're rocking the boat and yada, yada, yada. But what you find is that patients don't care.
Right.
They don't care. Because, you know, if you say that to an academic, you know, to an assistant professor who's trying to get tenure, he's going to back off. But you say that to a patient, they're not going to back off. So it's the problem with that, and it gets to your question, the problem with that is that for completely understandable reasons, each of those 10,000 diseases view themselves as a snowflake, a special case. And so when you go to get funding, what tends to happen is Congress gets inundated by 10,000 organizations, all of which want funding. And I've been told this by staffers over and over and over again, that just turns into white noise. They just don't even hear it. And so one of the major things that I was able to do at NCAS is to have people with various rare diseases realize that they have far more in common than they have different about themselves in terms of getting to the goal line of a drug which will help them or their family. And rather than focus, we all tend to do this as humans, right? I mean, we're 99.9% identical, and yet we focus on these tiny little changes, which sometimes are important for disease, of course, but we have much more in common. And when we do that, the power of that community of things like, you know, Global Genes now or Rare X at the Broad, for example, those are really, really important for funding. But I must say, I had a shocking conversation with a very high-level health staffer who shall go unnamed, but you know her well. And before I left, and we became very close, you know, because of everything that we were doing, and we were having lunch one day, and I asked her about rare disease funding, and she's just one of the four corners in the chief health staffers in the Congress, House and Senate. And she actually said to me, rare diseases. We never hear about rare diseases. We never hear about rare diseases. And I thought, wow. So we may think that we're making a really compelling argument, but it wasn't done in a way that reached the decision makers from an appropriation standpoint.
Yeah.
But so I think there's two lessons. One, their patients are critical. Two, find what you have in common rather than what you have different, you know, for at least for funding purposes, but also for science purposes. And And three, insist and create incentives that either select for people who will work on a multidisciplinary project team, or, and it's usually do both, or create incentives to have them do that.
Yeah.
So you don't have this atomization that you normally have.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting, when people lobbied Congress for the funding, they overlook the fact that the funding is going to be done the same old way it's been done since 1950.
Yes.
And that means half goes to overhead, and that means there's a huge fight between NIH and NCI and FDA.
Yep.
When we did the Cures Act, they put $1.8 billion in the cancer moonshot over 7 years. Former head of NIH, who won't be mentioned, who's the only head of NIH most of us have ever dealt with, made sure that all the money went to NIH and not to NCI and FDA. So we had to go back after the bill, and money we had promised, we had to have a whole nother thing to put it in the right place. So
Yep.
happens
all the time.
Happens all the time.
Yep.
So when we started Faster Cures 20-something years ago, we were looking at cultural changes, how to share data. We're now starting to do that much better. How to do adaptive clinical trials. We're starting to do that much better. How to get patients more involved. We're doing all that much better. Why aren't things moving more quickly? So here's an idea I got from Elias Zerhouni several years ago. I'd love your opinion of. Patients are the scarce resource. Researchers are the surplus resource, no offense. Why do we let the researchers do all the work on the clinical trials the way they want to see it? And then we go out and try to get the scarce resource to like it. Why don't we get the patient groups to organize the trials, put them out for bid, so the institutions can fight for it and show why they're the best ones to do it, and then do a clinical trial where the patients are the ones that put everything forward. And we know they can, because if you ask Tony Fauci about the HIV ACT UP activists and their knowledge of AIDS at the time, if he had not listened to them, it would have been another 5 years before anybody's life was saved from HIV. So what do you think about the patients taking control of the clinical trial design process, so they're not waiting for somebody at some wonderful place to say, we're going to do a trial, and by the way, hope you like it?
Yeah. Well, I think I always, first of all, anything Elias says, I'm likely to agree with, because he's just, he was the one. Everybody thinks it's Francis, but it's actually Elias who got me to NIH in the first place, and because he's a really different thinker, and so is Francis, but Elias really was, and still is. But I always choke a little bit over the word control, because Lord Acton was right, and whenever he's the one who said power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and so whenever you give somebody unilateral control, their head goes haywire. So but what you do have to do is have them be the coach, the one who's calling the plays, but they got to realize that they know a lot, but they don't know everything. But to create a circumstance where they are the ones who are ultimately driving the research agenda, but they do it in close collaboration with their partners. And I think about this like those of you who are married, and men particularly, I'm going to be stereotype here for a moment. You may think you're directing things,
Right?
but
No,
no, you're not.
the first 5 months, but not the last 29 years.
Yeah, exactly. So she is, your wife is the patient group. But she knows that to get certain things done, she needs you, and so she includes you, and it keeps, and that creates a very virtuous cycle. And this some of you may have seen the book that Amy Marcus published a couple of weeks ago. She's a reporter from the Wall Street Journal. It was not a cancer project, but it was a rare disease project on something called Niemann-Pick C disease, where she embedded herself in EdCats, and with this 20-person project team from 3 different institutes at the NIH, 4 different academic institutions, 7 different patient groups, and 2 companies, and we came together to create a drug for these children to treat their disease, untreatable disease, in their lifetime. In their lifetime, which meant 2-3 years, 4 years at the most.
Yeah.
That's normally not what you do. But, we did it. And Amy wanted to write about that because it was such an experience that's completely generalizable. And in that case, it's not all sweetness and light, of course, whenever you have people that get in a room, and we could talk about that. But this never would have happened if we hadn't come together as that patient-focused, patient-driven project team. And that's why she wanted to write the book, because it was such an extraordinary thing. And the title of the book even is interesting. She titled the book "We the Scientists," and she uses the word scientists on purpose to mean everybody on the research team, including the patients.
Right, citizen scientists, so to speak.
Yeah, but she doesn't call them citizen scientists.
She just calls them scientists.
They're scientists. What do you call it? What's Gary? A professional scientist? Or he is, but he's a scientist. Or Greg is a dilettante scientist.
I play one on TV. History major.
They're scientists, and they bring something really valuable to the table, and they really are game changers.
Yeah.
And if worse comes to worse, what they do is they shame big ego people into doing the right thing.
Right. So speaking of big ego people, let's talk very rapidly. Which institution do you think is most critical for what we're trying to do here this week? Mm-hmm. NIH, NCI, or ARPA-H?
Oh, geez.
Or none of the above?
Well, I guess the way I would answer it is we've had two of those institutions for a long time. They do a lot of great things. How we doing?
We could do better.
We could do better, right. ARPA-H is a real possibility, but of course everybody wants ARPA-H to solve their problem. So I'm hopeful, but I think we all have to be, have to keep our expectations contained. I think the other problem for NCI, and Gary would know this, Gary Kelloff, a lot of you know, old friend, longtime friend, he's not old, there is an understandable desire on the part of NCI and every other institute, for the most part, to focus on the disorders which numerically cause the most suffering and death. And that's, the big four or big five, prostate, lung, colon, et cetera. But the other 3,000-4,000 rare cancers are just tend to be lower down on the list for the most part. And so there are people who have argued in this direction. Some of you probably know David Heisong, who's a very vocal adenoid cystic carcinoma guy, very eloquent, talking about this, that it's a both and of course, many of the insights that we have into every disease, of course, came from studies of rare diseases and rare cancers. I mean, this was something that William Harvey said 300, 400, 500 years ago, and it's true. But that can be a hard sell for funders sometimes. So I think what I think would have to happen is that you need NCI. There are some great people at NCI, a lot of them.
And a new director.
Mm-hmm.
And a new director.
Yes, and
Monica.
Ned was really wonderful, and I know Andy's going to be here tomorrow, and so they've had a legacy of this. But you have to realize that they are not free agents to do anything they want.
Right.
And I found this big time when I ran ANCATS.
Right.
Because an institute director has 536 bosses, every congressman, every senator, and the president, as well as your real boss. And so each of these folks is beholden to the largest employers in their district and the largest fundees in their district. And so the whole system, like most ecosystems, is remarkably homeostatic. it responds to disruption by pushing back against that disruption. And if you've ever heard Jim Dorshow talk about this, and that he's one of the leaders of the NCI, he'll tell you about this, where he's tried to wrest control from the cancer centers, for instance, and it didn't go well for him.
No, it didn't. Yeah. It's never gone well. The cancer centers are independent fiefdoms, and God bless, when von Eschenbach tried to get them to all work together on data, the answer was no. End of story.
But I will say, and that's absolutely true. But I do want to say, I was head of the CTSA program, which is about twice the size of the Cancer Center program, a lot of the same characteristics. And that program is very different now than it was when I took it over. And we could talk about why that is, but that's probably less relevant than the fact that these things can change. But what it requires is very strong leadership and persistence. Because everybody thought I was going to go away. And they did everything they could to make my life miserable. I actually had people asking me, seriously, friends of mine, asking me if I am checking under my car when I go to leave at night.
Wow.
Because you're messing with people's money. And these are big, multi-billion-dollar organizations. They tend to say, oh, we're just charities. Come on.
Right.
They are larger than most pharmas. And they don't react well when their money is messed with. And new demands are put on them. But I'll tell you one story which gave me great hope, which is that when I had tried everything, cajoling, arguing, threatening, and we were making some headway, but in desperation, I appealed to their idealism.
How'd that go?
Incredibly well. I thought, there's no way this is going to work. But I said to this group of 60, hard-boiled empire builders, folks, can we just talk for a minute about why we got into this? Did we get into this to wield power over people to build a big institution or build an empire? No, we got into this business to help people. And I want to reorient us in that direction. And I thought I'd be laughed out of the room. I wasn't.
That's great.
And when COVID came around, this group, just spectacular, absolutely spectacular. So change is possible. But it requires, if you're a geneticist, I'm looking at Jane here, if you're legit, it requires long-term selective pressure. You got to put pen strep in the media and keep it going. Because if you let off the selective, then you get growth of all kinds of things. So pen strep is the answer. Human pen strep.
So let me ask a compound question, and then I'll entertain questions from all of you. So your list for what we really need to look at: patients on the research team, multi-disease models, mutations, not origin of the cancer, gene therapy issues in terms of manufacturing and accuracy, natural history studies, regulatory changes, we're all familiar, and organs on a chip. So the question is, petitioning our government to do this is the slow way to get it done. This group is trying to figure out how do we get it done more quickly where we are. And I'm sure there are phenomenal institutions represented all across the room. So the question is, if we want to, if we can, and everybody here understands all those issues I just said, how do we self-organize with patients, passion, what I call passion capital or philanthropy, resources of people who know stuff about appendiceal cancer, which is not a big group. How do we self-organize in a way that we can create a model for dealing with appendiceal cancer that's also relevant to cholangiocarcinoma and all sorts of other rare cancers that we're dealing with, without having to petition anybody else to do anything? How do we use our skills, our resources, our institutions so that when people go back and they're working on Thursday in their office or their lab, or in my case, their bedroom, what do they need to ask themselves about how to organize this effort?
First of all, it's been done before successfully. So we should look in this community, if you haven't done it already, you should look at examples where it's worked. And you talked about one of them. When you look, like any good scientist, you look, okay, you did an experiment, did it work or did it not work? When it worked, what was the critical ingredient? There's a lot of things are going to vary, but the critical ingredient is a well-organized, passionate, business-savvy patient. And if you think of, Kathy Giusti or, you, Greg, or any of the other, David, any of these folks, and by business savvy, I don't mean that they need to be making a lot of money. It's that business people tend to focus on deliverables. And what's a distinction that I find useful, that there are a lot of great people who are focused on what's interesting, and then there are other people who are focused on what's useful. And here, you have to be focused on what's useful. And there's a lot of useful things that aren't terribly interesting, and there's a lot of interesting things that aren't useful at all. And so, but that is really critical. And then you need, and then they're not going to go anywhere. Right? They're not going to get bored and go, take another job, because they're the patient. You got to have that. That then you do what you did in this meeting, and I've done dozens of these now, where we will have dozens of people that we invite, experts, and we have them talk. Sometimes give 10-minute talk or something, and you can very quickly figure out who's, if I might be so bold, who's a jerk, who's not, who is going to be a team player, who's not, and who has a certain practical bent. It's just the way people talk. And then you take those people and you all the attendees, you send out an email that says, okay, or whatever it is, and then you say, okay, we're putting this thing together, vote with your feet. And what I've found multiple times is that people do vote with their feet, as long as you make it clear to them what's in it for them, because they do have to pay the bills, and then you always have to make certain phone calls to people that you want, who are too busy to contribute, but you really want them. But if you call them, then you end up with a group of maybe 10 people at the most, because remember, think Margaret Mead here. Right.
Right.
And the bigness, as I learned in big pharma and elsewhere at Merck, at NIH, and when you do that, and you need a project manager to do it as well. You need somebody to keep all the dogs lashed to the sled, so we're all pulling in the same direction. But and then at the first meeting of this, you come up with a research plan. Who's going to do what, on what time frame? What is the critical path? When are we going to get there? And human beings really are like sled dogs. They love to work together to do something hard. We're going to go Fairbanks. We're going to go Anchorage to Nome, like the Iditarod, and if it really matters, and you have patience on the team, oh my God, you would see. I've had this in my own career. People who said, "Now I understand why I'm doing this. I'm not going to work 24/7. I'm going to work 25/7 because I understand it now." And that kind of magic is self-reinforcing, because the team accomplishes things. They depend on each other. They're all pulling in the same direction, and you got patients there who are so darn grateful for what you're doing. It's not like NIH where you put in your annual report and you send it to some nameless building in Bethesda and nobody ever reads it and all that. There's immediate feedback for it. But you do have to come up with, it's not that the government isn't useful for money, it is, but it in the cases I've seen where it's successful, it can't be your only source.
Right.
Yeah.
So this group, I hope, will think of itself as a team, not as a collection of institutions and individual programs, but as a team. And my pet peeve, going back a long time, is that we still operate as if we're in a zero-sum game.
Yes.
And I know
I should have mentioned it. No, you're absolutely right.
I know the government grants are a zero-sum game, but that's not all the money that's out there. The Cystic Fibrosis Foundation spent $150 million of families' money over 15 years, and when the CEO of Vertex bought the company that was working on CF, he did not even know they had the program. Yeah. And he tried to kill it. The family showed up, and he said to me later, my team was so invested in these families, I could not have stopped that program if I wanted to. Yeah. If I'd said stop, no one would have listened to me. So the failure of our system, our capitalist system, is that we put the burden on the patients to organize you. Yeah. And going to the government, I think, is a false flag, because I've tried to get groups forever not to just go for themselves, but to fix the culture and fix the infrastructure so everybody can use it. But when I say it's not a zero-sum game, there are non-government resources, there are family offices, there are philanthropists, there are passion capital, there are people, human capital, that are in great supply. If we ask them to do things, as you say, they will do it. So as we go through tomorrow, I hope we can think of this as, what is my role on the team? What is my role on the team? And you don't need anybody telling you what your role is or looking over your shoulder. You all know what your role could be. So then we have to figure out, how do you do that in this world? And we'll stop there. Questions? And then we have mics, and you can use the mic.
Can I say one thing? Because it's such an important point. That zero-sum game, fixed pie model is the death of this kind of project. And it is such a false concept, because if you look at advances in any area of human endeavor, the whole point is making the pie bigger, right? 1 + 1 = 3. It doesn't equal 2. But our whole system has everybody brainwashed into thinking that it isn't. But I got to tell you, and Monique and I experienced this, if you give people a taste of the other, oh boy, they never want to go back.
Right. That's right. Over here.
Great. Thank you. First of all, wow.
And please introduce yourself, because not everybody knows everybody.
Monique Mansour. I'm currently at MITRE, formerly a student of Andrew Lowe here at MIT, formerly a colleague of Chris at NCATS before it was NCATS, and 10 years at BARDA, 20 years of doing pandemic preparedness. Yeah. The other side of the spectrum, arguably, from rare disease is what we just experienced, or still experience with COVID. Every person on this planet affected in some way and vulnerable to this virus. I'd be interested in, other than sort of the obvious mRNA technology and its transfer, value to the world of oncology, what you see as the lessons to extract that are of value to this community in appendiceal cancer. And, again, to your point of 1 + 1 = 3, is infectious disease a collaborator, somebody in competition, somebody in conflict with the goals of the team here today?
I'm going to say one thing, then you can say several things. I think the biggest lesson I learned was that we are empathy challenged in this culture. You can't address this cancer without empathy, because most people don't have it. And most people won't get it. Most people won't know anybody who gets it. Pandemic proved to me, if you're not willing to wear a piece of cloth over your face to save somebody, how are we going to do anything in this country? I mean, really. The irony is, I'm the one in the family with leukemia. I didn't get COVID until I went to my mother's 100th birthday party in February. My wife, my sister and her husband, we all got COVID. Who did not have to be in bed for a week? The guy with leukemia. But yet, they have been taking care of me for 3 years, being super careful. If we can't fix the empathy problem, I don't know how we fix any problem.
Yeah, I think I think that's right. And but on the other hand, if you do look at how the community, and I'm most familiar with the academic community, the pharma community, the biotech community, the government, even the NIH institutes started to work together.
What a concept.
Whoa, what's that about? Is what it told us is that imminent death is motivating, right? So everybody was worried that they were going to die of COVID. It's like all of a sudden everybody in the world has appendiceal cancer. People would get off their rear ends and they'd collaborate. I had people calling me who kept giving me all these shaggy dog stories about why they couldn't share data. I got calls from these people, 20 of these people within a week saying, we want to share our data. Can you help us put this thing, and it became this thing called N3C, which exists now. And I always felt like saying, okay, now hold on a second. Aren't you the guy who's been telling me that you can't share data for the last 10 years?
Last 50 years.
And yeah, right. And so one of the things that I talked about a lot before I still talk about a lot is, how do we inculcate that idea into other people? And I think you're right that it's difficult. It's difficult, and so that is why you have to have the infected COVID equivalent, which is this community with appendiceal cancer, because they know the urgency of this, and so I think there are lessons to be learned from COVID. One of them being that people can collaborate. So we can't say anymore, we can't do it any better. We have to admit, we won't. And I challenge people with this moral question. If you do this for COVID, but you don't do it for appendiceal cancer, you are saying, let's just be honest, that the lives of people who have COVID are more important than the lives of people with appendiceal cancer. Are you willing to say that?
Right.
And if you're not willing to say that, share your data. And I think it has to be put in that kind of stark way.
Right.
And the people who can do that the best are the patients.
Right.
And I know some of you have been at this for a long time too.
But the system is memory metal, and the biggest threat is that it bounces back to you have to be in a big city for a clinical trial. You have to, blah, blah, blah. You know the rest of it.
Yeah.
That can't happen. Yes, sir.
Yeah, hi, I'm Karen Schrag. I'm from Yale University. And first off, I enjoyed your dog analogies. I think one of the stakeholders that are sort of included but are missed are the busy clinicians. The surgeons that are operating, the clinicians that are seeing a lot of patients, and they are like the bulldogs. They're not the sled dogs or the golden retrievers. They have purpose. They want to protect their patients, and they want to really advocate for them. But I think the current health systems are not easily facilitated towards these clinicians being engaged in this care. So I think as a group of us, surgical oncologists or even medical oncologists, we all know each other. We work well with each other. We want to share data. We want to write trials. We want to do stuff. But I think it's a very few of us who actually are sitting, doing, writing R01s or doing that type of work. But it doesn't mean we don't want to advance the field much faster than it is right now. So I guess maybe speak a little bit to that, because I think the competing healthcare pressures that are coming from health systems, even including academic institutions, how do you envision changing that, not just for appendix cancer, but for other rare diseases as well?
Do you want to answer that?
Well, you have to talk fast, because when they find out he's from Yale, they may ask him to make him leave.
Yeah, I know. I usually don't answer questions from people from Yale, but I'll make an exception in this case. The only way I've seen it work, data-driven answer, is that you cannot have the busy surgeon, or the busy other clinician for that matter, have to do all the work themselves. You have to have, they're a player on a team, but you have to view them as the place kicker or the tight end, whatever the analogy is, who's may not be on every play, and he doesn't have to organize the team, doesn't have to be the coach. But he's critical. You're not going to win games without the place kicker, right? Without the guy who kicks the field goal and with 2 seconds left. But if you said to the field goal kicker, you got to organize the whole thing if you want to score goals, he's not going to do it. And even if he wants to, he's not going to do it, or she's not going to do it. But I've seen over and over again that surgeons in many ways are more amenable to this kind of an attitude because they go into something to get something done, right? I'm a neurologist, for God's sake. I'm completely the other end, and I give you the host of neurologist jokes. Whereas, surgeons they're very deliverable focused, and they want to get something done, and they want to make people better. But they unfortunately are now, like most clinicians, they got to do a appendectomy every 12 minutes, so they don't have a lot of time to do this. But if you could put them on a team where they can contribute their piece and maybe even get a little academic credit or maybe a little extra funding or something, then they're very enthusiastic about taking part. But I think if we go back to what Greg said is right. If you look at the everybody knows what the head of an NIH grant in general. What do we call them? The principal investigator, right? So who's the principal investigator on a successful football team? Is it the quarterback? Is it the offensive lineman? Is it the place kicker? Who is it? And yet the NIH system insists that you have one person who is one ring to rule them all. It's just silly, which is why this is hard to do this in the NIH system. But it isn't hard if you do it with a patient-derived system.
And I would go even farther to say we shouldn't ask people to do it. It should be automated to do it. For instance, you have dinner. Before you get to dessert, they ask you how it was. What do you think? What about the restaurant? What about the service? You watch a dog video on Instagram. The next minute, you have 100 dog videos on your Instagram. I know this because I watch golf videos. I have 1,000 golf videos on Instagram. So why is it that when you're diagnosed with a rare cancer, or basically any cancer, nothing happens? The moment you know you have cancer, everything should happen all at once, everywhere. Yeah. In fact, they made a movie about it. So why is it that the patient has to find the right doctor? You all know this. People call you and they say, I need help to find the right doctor, the right place. And you find out they've been at the wrong place for 3 months or 6 months in a disease where they have 3 years. It breaks my heart. And then the second thing that breaks my heart is that they had to call me. Who am I? I'm a friggin' history major. I just happen to know people like you. That should not be their burden. It should be automatic. You have cancer, your doctor puts in you have cancer of X or Y, and everything happens. The best places, the best doctors, the best treatments, all pop up. That is not how it works in any cancer. And nobody's working on that. Nobody's working on that. People don't want you to leave their hospital. I grew up in Arkansas in the Delta. There were no cancer doctors in my hometown. You could only get cancer on Tuesday or Thursday when they came over from Memphis. That's still that way 71 and a half years later. Right. It's still that way. So we need to, this is not the hard part. This should be the easy part. Because with our information technology and our social media, the moment you know you have that problem, everything should show up on your screen. My friend I mentioned who died of multiple myeloma called me 6 months after his diagnosis, and he hadn't found the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation. I was shocked. He shouldn't have had to find it. Should have found him. That's not how it works. But that is a problem we can fix.
And I do think there are, I think about people, I'm looking, where's Andrew? There he is. Andrew got into this, as a lot of you know, because of a rare cancer in his family. Amy Marcus, who I mentioned before, got into this because her mother developed cholangiocarcinoma, gallbladder cancer. And she had exactly the same questions that Andrew had, like, why, who's doing what, where are the therapies, and why do I have to do all this? How are you making the decision what to work on? And so there is a critical mass of people who are we somehow haven't figured out a way to make it go viral yet, right?
Even though the cancer has gone viral. So
Yes, right, yeah.
we only have a short amount of time. Yes, sir.
Chris Hughes, UC Irvine, and founder of Arikari Biosciences, which is why I'm here today. So a couple of things I'd like to talk about. One of the powers of rare diseases is the groups of patients that do get together, and it's a very tight-knit community, and they do have some power. It's very sad to hear, Chris, that where they think they have a voice, it sounds like it peters out before it gets to the people that really matter in Congress. Right. But they do have the power to, for example, get line items put into budgets so that their disease can be funded. I do a lot of work with the rare disease charity Cure-HHT, hereditary hemorrhagic telangiectasia. And we've done a lot of advocacy, and we have got line items and budgets so that people can apply for money to get funding for research through the government. So that is a strength of rare diseases. So if you can nucleate patients, they will have a voice. The other thing you mentioned is it's important to listen to patients. One of the things we found in this particular disease, a lot of us basic scientists coming to it were super interested about vascular malformations in the brain. It was an interesting scientific area. We all wanted to work on it. If they burst, it's very devastating to the patient. Talk to the patients, they don't actually care about that. All they cared about was that the massive nosebleeds that they had. To them, that was the important thing. And so that helped a lot of us kind of refocus on what we scientifically didn't think was the most important question, but was more important to the patient. Did a clinical trial, and we can help people with that now. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. I totally agree. You've got to listen to the patients. If you've got a rare disease, you've got to get them working together. And then the second thing, you talked about how do we here today, tomorrow, get this moving. One of the things I found so impressive about what NCATS did under Chris was with the Tissue Chips initiative. And we took a bunch of scientists who want to follow the science wherever it leads, but you kind of need to get to a product, and that sort of brings in the entrepreneurial, the business side of things. And the way NCATS did it was made us write milestones and live by milestones. And what then happened was that we ignored all the little side branches that looked interesting scientifically, focused on getting a product. And we did. And now there are lots of tissue chips out there. FDA has now agreed that these are important and they can be used for INDs. So I think that's the way forward, is to be milestone driven. And just get us as scientists to actually focus on the task at hand, ignore all the cool little science on the edge, and just have a goal and stick to it.
No, you're absolutely right. And you're absolutely right. That's
actually, I'm going to ask for a very quick response. We are absolutely out of time.
Oh, okay. I was just going to say that is why the tissue chip program worked. You turn golden retrievers into bloodhounds. They stay very focused on the critical path. And so if we could all, I'm going to wear a bloodhound T-shirt tomorrow, I think.
So last point for tomorrow. At the end of the Cancer Moonshot, or during the Moonshot, I kept getting calls from reporters, what can you really get done in 9 months? And I told each of them, 9 months is half of the life of a patient with glioblastoma. It's a quarter of the life of my friend who died of multiple myeloma. You're asking me what we can finish in 9 months. The answer is not much. What can we start is the question you want to ask. And we could start a lot. And we did. We started 80 different collaborations. The question for this group is, what can we start in 9 weeks, given the life expectancy of people with this disease? What can we start within the next 9 weeks that we carry out in the next 9 months? That's the real question. And it really does come down to, you're a member of the team. What's your best role? How can we get it done? And just so you know, these are the list of problems that Chris gave me. This will all be discussed tomorrow, but not the problems, the answers to these problems. So that's what we're looking to do tomorrow. Thank you all for coming. I've known Steve and Kathy for 3 decades. I'm so happy I was invited to do this. And Chris, was invited very late, and I really want to thank you for making time to do this.
So as soon as I heard from you and Andrew, there's an spinal reflex. Yes, yeah. So
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you. I want to thank you both for joining us. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I hope we've given you lots to think about tonight, and I want you to bring your ideas and your energy back here, same place, actually just on the other side of the wall, but I think you'll find it. And we'll be starting at 8 o'clock registration, and we'll be starting the program at 8:30 tomorrow. Thank you both.
wonderful. Thank you, sir. That was great.
Thanks, man.
Great fun.